it might be a little more difficult to engage in my call and response, right? But we're so happy you're here. I'm Robert Solomon. I serve as the Vice President for the Office for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusive Engagement. And we are delighted that you're here for our final Power Diversity Lecture Series for this semester. We'll have another lineup for you next semester. It's always tough to try to, okay, how can we top or match what we did the previous semester? But we'll do our best. But we are excited to feature one of our North Star faculty scholars, Dr. John Bickers, who's with us, and we're just delighted that he is going to share his wisdom with us. And I remember thinking back when we first met and really just talking about his interest in his research, and that's when we were, recruiting him and trying to convince him to come here and saying, well, we'd love to have you here to come speak and to participate, and we're just elated that this has come to fruition. And so you may know that the Office for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusive Engagement sponsors the Power of Diversity Lecture Series every year. And the purpose of the series is to inspire campus dialogue, community engagement, and civic education and learning about the national narrative on diversity and inclusion. And these issues can be incredibly broad and stretch a considerable swath. Now, one way this mission comes alive is through certainly the support of our North Star Faculty Initiative, among other things that we're doing on campus. Some of you may know that in July of 2021, the Office of the Provost launched this program to really help us catalyze the hiring of faculty members who are committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and will bring this rich perspective to Case Western Reserve University. So today we're excited to give you a glimpse into the brilliance of the North Star Program Initiative with Dr. John Bickers. John is an assistant professor of history here at Case Western. And is a citizen of the Miami tribe of Oklahoma. He specializes in early American and Native American history. His research focuses on indigenous constructions of citizenship and race and theories of Native political sovereignty and governance. His first book project, tentatively entitled The Miami Nation, A Middle Path for Indigenous Nationhood, is an exploration of the political history of the Miami tribe through the 19th and early 20th century, in which he argues for indigenous forms of nation building based on traditional political ideology rather than Euro-American concepts of governance. Now, earlier this year, he and Professor Noel Voets were awarded a higher learning grant, embarking on a 3-year journey through a more accurate and comprehensive narrative of Black and Native American political life in the United States before the modern civil rights movement. Now, their project, Native Americans and African Americans in and out of the U.S. body politic, was awarded an inaugural higher learning grant by the Mellon Foundation, the nation's largest non-federal funder of the humanities and a major contributor to higher education programs. So there's just a lot of exciting work ahead for Dr. Bickers coming before you. So I won't labor anymore, but I'll turn things over to him. But I do want to remind you that at the conclusion of his remarks, we will have a time for questions. And so get ready, write your questions down, and pay attention and see what really strikes you and resonates with you. So at this time, let's give John Bickers a warm Case Western Reserve welcome.
Missionary, Dr. Solon, big thank you. And thank you to the Power Diversity Lecture Series for inviting me to be here. I'm very excited. Ayachege, Tepewe Neolaka Koke, Owahanungi Kakikwe, Amalia Wenswiane, Nilamiamia Mitosenia, Palanzwa Sekakweta, Elapakasa Ane. Nila Nipwangia, Melone Tehe Ane, Ishi Mitosene Weyangwe. I introduced you in Miamia Talenge, in the Miami language, in my heritage language. I said, hello, my name is John Bickers. I'm a professor here at Case Western Reserve studying Native American history, and I'm a citizen of the Miami tribe of Oklahoma and a descendant of the Godfrey Band, specifically. As you might guess, this is a subject that's been really important to me in my life, but how Native peoples have engaged with or been excluded from the academy. And Native peoples have had a really, really long history engaging with European styles of education and academic institutions that we're going to get into today, starting from the very, very beginning of the English colonial project in the 1600s all the way to the 21st century today. So we're going to cover a lot of ground. But to start with, I think we'll start out with, as many of these talks go nowadays, with a land acknowledgement statement from Case Western Reserve. Let's see. It does not, the screen did not change for me. Is there a way to fix that?
It is up there.
So I'll read it looking up. In recognizing, and I'll project. In recognizing the land upon which we reside, we express our gratitude, appreciation to those who have lived and worked here before us, those whose stewardship and resilient spirit make our residence possible on the traditional homeland of the Lenape, Delaware, Shawnee, Wyandot, Miami, Ottawa, Potawatomi, and other Great Lakes tribes, including the Chippewa, Kickapoo, Wea, Piankashaw, and Kaskaskia. We also acknowledge the thousands of Native Americans who now call the Northeast Ohio home. Case Western Reserve University and the greater Cleveland area occupy lands officially ceded by 1,100 chiefs and warriors signing the Treaty of Greenville in 1795. Let's see, is there a way to fix this? Because this is going to be an issue. There we go. All right. Recently, these statements have become really, really popular in academic and other institutions of higher learning. And importantly so, because they convey important knowledge about the history of Native peoples in whatever place or space they're in. But I want to begin with a conversation about what that actually means. And I want to start out with another statement by one of the preeminent authorities on Native American studies, the great Vine Deloria, who said in his seminal work, Custer Died for Your Sins, when talking about the academy, quote, "The fundamental thesis of the anthropologist is that people are objects for observations, people are then considered objects for experimentation, for manipulation, and for eventual extinction. The anthropologist thus furnishes the justification for treating Indian people like so many chessmen available for anyone to play with." Now, while he specifically targets anthropologists here, and he has his own reasons for doing so, the statement can be made about a number of fields in the academy: history, linguistics, sociology, medical technology, clinicians, any research field that deals with human beings, living or deceased. The academy has a long history of using Native peoples, Native ideas, Native knowledge, and Native bodies to increase its own body of knowledge and increase its own preeminence in the field. And Vine Deloria also makes something very explicitly clear that I find very implicitly clear in many of these land acknowledgement statements. Despite being an academic himself, teaching at several universities throughout his career, he very clearly makes a demarcation between academics, or in this case anthropologists specifically, and Native peoples. The two are fundamentally different species. The anthropologist experiments and dehumanizes Native peoples, and Native peoples are dehumanized and experimented on by anthropologists. There are no Native anthropologists, there are no Native scholars, there are no scholars who are Native in this worldview. And if you go back to these land acknowledgement statements, you can see the implicit bias here. I've read quite a few of these in my career. I did my PhD at Ohio State, so I've been reading a lot of Ohio-based land acknowledgement statements where my people call home. The Miami tribe is in the land acknowledgement statement. And it always feels really, really weird to me when I read some of these, because it doesn't sound like a Miami person saying these things. It doesn't sound like a Native person saying these things. It feels very removed. It feels like a non-Native person, a non-Native scholar, talking to a room of non-Native peoples about Native peoples. And there's a lot of reasons for that. One is our intentional exclusion from a lot of aspects of the academy due to racism, settler colonial violence, intellectual Eurocentrism, and a myriad of other issues. But two, one of the reasons we feel really, really removed is because Native peoples also have an innate distrust of the modern academy. And we'll get into why that is, and it's often because the academy has failed Native peoples time and time again. As long as we have statements like this, it reinforces this idea that Deloria puts before us, that Native peoples and academics are truly separate species. And hopefully that's something that has been corrected over the last few years and we continue to correct. And I hope in this presentation to show us ways in which we might do that and where we failed to do that as academics, as scholars. So the first thing to kind of go into is one simply of terminology. What is education? We in the academy, we scholars like to have a monopoly on that term. Education, higher education is this. It's the grand lecture halls speaking to people, prognosticating on high about these vast, lofty ideas we have, and it's based off of these earlier European models. And that's one form of education. It's certainly one, again, we in the academy take for granted, but it's not the only form of education. Rather, for this talk, I want to define education as the mechanisms through which the community transmits knowledge from one generation to the next. Nothing fancy, nothing too complicated, simply the transmission of knowledge from one generation to the next. And by that definition, of course, Native peoples have had education. It has looked different over the years. We look at this one image, this painting from the 1820s of Potawatomi women gathering together on the Wabash River. And you see them teaching and talking to their children, educating them about the tools they need to survive, about their history, their language, their culture. We see here Native children in a more European-style academy in the 19th century, things that look more familiar to us. And of course, we see here a modern Native graduation, Native peoples wearing bright colors and regalia and ways of displaying their indigenous identity, again, in what looks like a more formal European style of education system. And so I want to really emphasize that when I talk about education here in this talk, when I talk about scholars or academics, I am doing so in the European sense of the term, in the American sense of the term. When the people I quote here talk about Native peoples getting educated, they're referring to a European style of education. And I want to quote here from Dr. Henrietta Mann of the Cheyenne Arapaho Nation, preeminent Native educator throughout the 20th century. Quote, "Contrary to popular belief, education and the transmission and acquisition of knowledge and skills did not come to the North American continent on the Nina, the Pinta, or the Santa Maria. Neither did it come on the Mayflower. Education is as native to this continent as Native peoples. We, as the Native peoples of this continent, have had our own means of educating our youth. We had a rich oral tradition, which was and is yet today a means of education for the Native American." And so when I talk about the academy, when I talk about education, I want to be very, very clear. I am talking about it from this European construction. And always know that the Native peoples I'm talking about, the Native communities I'm talking about, despite what the white scholars I'm quoting might say, are absolutely educated. They're just not educated in a way that Eurocentric minds can recognize. But as I said, the Native experience with the academy, with education, starts at the very, very beginning of the American colonial project, the Anglo-American colonial project. Harvard in 1650, in its charter, said its goal was to, quote, educate the education of the English and Indian youth of this country in knowledge and in godliness. In fact, in 1661, the Wampanoag man depicted here, Caleb Chichitamak, was enrolled in Harvard. Now, of course, these were not the integrated schools that we might think of today. He and his Wampanoag and Massachusetts associates cohort were enrolled in what was called the Indian School. It was a separate branch of Harvard for Native peoples. And they had a separate branch in Harvard for Native peoples because they had separate goals for Native peoples when they're trying to educate them. While their colleagues in the regular Harvard learned the classics, Greek, Homer, the Iliad, the Odyssey, Thomas Aquinas, all these things that we think of as the traditional Latin canon, these people were taught primarily two things. One, literacy, so they could operate the school's printing press. They were employees, unpaid employees, as much as they were students. And also to learn the Bible. It was a religious education program. And in fact, that same year that Caleb and his other students came to Harvard, They began work on what was printed in 1663 here, known as the Eliot Bible. It was the first Bible ever printed in North America. And it was printed in the Massachusetts language, an Algonquian language indigenous to the state of Massachusetts, of which several of the students were. This Bible was believed to be a tool by John Eliot, a reverend who worked there, to evangelize and convert Native peoples in New England to Christianity, to further remove them from their traditional cosmologies, ways of life, family structures, and all the things that made them indigenous. And so Native peoples were allowed in these institutions, but at a price and with a divide. They were still not allowed to be full scholars in the way that their contemporaries were. Another example is Dartmouth, founded in 1769 by the Reverend Elizur Wheelock. And he founded Dartmouth explicitly to create a new generation of Native converts that could be used to further his missionary aims in converting Native peoples. And in fact, I'll let him speak for himself here when he describes his plans for the foundation of Dartmouth College. Quote, "I say when I have considered the impediments of an English mission among the Indians, it has been settled in my mind that the most likely, expedient way of accomplishing the great design meaning the conversion of Native peoples to his form of Protestant Christianity, is to take their own children and give them an education amongst ourselves, under tuition and guidance of a godly and skillful master, where they may not only have means to make them scholars, but the best means to make them Christians indeed, to fit them for the gospel ministry among the respective tribes." They did not accept these students simply as out of the goodness of their hearts or truly, as he says, to really create scholars, but to create new groups of missionaries to further convert Native peoples to Christianity, a process which is known as assimilation. And I'll talk a little bit about how that's impacted, but I want to go back for a second to my previous slide and actually spell out what assimilation actually means and what the repercussions of it are. Because we often talk about the definitions of assimilation, but not the unspoken implications. First and foremost, as all these students will see, and you saw here with Caleb here, dressing in American or European or Western style clothing. That's how it's discussed. But that also means losing their traditional style of clothing, their traditional material culture, the things that displayed them as members of their community. Native peoples east of the Mississippi would often say they could recognize what tribe a person was from by the design on their moccasins. Clothing signified not only your status in the community, but what community you belong to. And by stripping students away from their traditional clothing, that also stripped them away of their community. And of course, speaking English is first and foremost on this list. But it's not just speaking English. It's no longer speaking your language. It's being removed from your heritage language. And so often it's documented in a variety of these schools. The Native peoples, these Native children who are taken out of their home at a very young age, have trouble returning to their community because they literally could not speak to their parents or grandparents or aunts and uncles or cousins or friends because it had been so long since they heard their own language and all they knew was English. And of course, this is the goal of these institutions. Like Harvard and Dartmouth and many other institutions, converting to Christianity is one of the first and foremost goals, creating Christian Native peoples. As was so common in the 1600s, 1700s, frankly in the 21st century, people often have a hard time distinguishing Euro-American culture from Christianity as a religion. And so when these missionaries came to convert to Christianity, what they really meant was a full assimilation into European society. They preached a white Jesus to a native people and believed that in order to become Christian, you had to exhibit these ideas of whiteness. And again, it's not just converting to Christianity. It's surrendering their traditional beliefs and cosmologies and the ways that their worlds are structured. It's surrendering their understanding that when it rains, when there's a thunderstorm, it's their grandfather, the thunderbird in the sky, making these noises. It's their understanding that when they're sick, there are certain plants that can medicinally heal them because that's what they were taught by their grandmothers. It's removing all of these knowledge systems and replacing it with Christianity. And of course, it's residing in American spaces. Now, some people, like Wheelock here, intended for his graduates to return to their communities to missionize. Many did not. In fact, many of these early Protestant missionary efforts encouraged Native men to marry white women, to live in these New England towns, to separate themselves further from their community. And so it's not just residing in American spaces. It's not just moving to Oxford, Massachusetts, or Philadelphia. It's physically removing yourselves from your community, not just your extended family, but your nation, your people, and losing that connection. And of course, all this boils down to a simple phrase that we'll expand more on in a few minutes, but has become emblematic of the entire history of Native peoples in American education. Kill the Indian, save the man. And this is a very powerful image you'll see quite a lot when talking about American education. This was a Navajo boy who was taken to the Carlisle boarding school, which we'll talk about shortly. The image is taken when he first appeared, and the second image was taken of him 3 years later. The operator of the school would often take these before and after pictures of students to show them to white, liberal, progressive donors the success of their missionary efforts in a ideology that argued that they did not need to physically exterminate Native peoples, but could culturally exterminate them. And Tom, the Navajo boy's name was Tom's image, has become quite emblematic of these experiences because you can see the very, very drastic change that has happened to him in just but 3 years at these schools. But these educational, these religious schools were often very small, often very local, sometimes run by a denomination, but often run by an individual minister. Some were as large as Harvard and Dartmouth and some of these grand schools. And I want to point this out. If you look at this is the seal of Dartmouth College until I believe 2018, they recently changed it. But since its founding, it's had some variation of the seal. And you have 2 Native men holding a book, walking out of the woods into the school, which is gleamed by the light of providence with the book, with not just the book, the Bible. The purpose of this school, even up until 2018, as they labeled it, was the assimilation of Native peoples and the removal of Native peoples from what they viewed as savagery. They're leaving the woods into now these halls of education. Again, the people that are coming into these schools, Caleb, were absolutely educated, just not in the way that these scholars deemed proper or civil. It was not a civilized education. But these schools continued, often more as small camps throughout the United States. In the 1820s and 18-teens, a man named Isaac McCoy set up several missions in what's now Indiana and Michigan. In the 1820s, the Quakers set up a Shawnee mission in Wapakoneta, Ohio, in this very state, where it was individual Quakers coming and educating, providing religious education to Native peoples, generally with the consent of the community, because they were actually coming into the community. Unfortunately for them, from their perspective, these educational opportunities, these educational mechanisms did not have the correct effect, because they're still teaching Native children in their communities, in their villages. The child will go to school, he might learn to read, he might learn some of the Bible, he might learn some English, but then he's going back home to his family, to his community, where they're speaking their native language, they're dressing in native ways, they're continuing their traditional existence as they've always wanted to. And so being very, very clear by the mid to late 19th century that these kinds of institutions were not enough. There needed to be a standardization, and there needed to be larger institutional support if they were going to educate the Native American. And all of this starts first and foremost with a man named Henry Pratt, a veteran of the Western Wars, fighting Cheyenne, Arapaho, Kiowa, Comanche, Caddo, and all other tribes in what's now Kansas, Colorado, Utah, Arizona, was given charge of 72 Native peoples, hostages from these wars, to take down to Fort Marion in Florida. And again, these are people from Arizona and Utah and Colorado, being shipped to Florida to be held prisoner as negotiating tools to convince their relatives, their friends, to come to an American terms for peace. Of course, these terms for peace meant selling their lands, giving up their way of life, and moving on to reservations in the worst land in the region. But peace. While there, Pratt noticed something very interesting in dealing with these people, because you see, for the last several decades, as the U.S. conducted its Indian wars, there became a common ideology that Native peoples and we'll get into this a little bit, how that happened, were simply inherently savage. That the only way to solve what they called the Indian problem was the physical extermination and murder of native peoples. These Western wars in particular in the 1850s, 60s, 70s, and 80s were known for their brutality, where American soldiers slaughtered men, women, and children indiscriminately, where bodily mutilations of the dead were incredibly common, where even American troops were horrified by some of the things they saw and some of the things they did. It was a brutal, brutal series of wars that had just begun, that were coming to an end, or the Americans believed were coming to an end, hence these captives. And Pratt had been right in the middle of this. He had been at some of the deadliest massacres in these Western wars. He had killed Native peoples indiscriminately. But working and living with these captives, these prisoners, he'd begun to notice something he found rather peculiar. They were people. They were human beings. They had intelligence. They could learn things. And so he, with military permission, set up a little school in this camp, in this prison camp, where he taught them woodworking, because they didn't know how to do that. He taught them how to make weapons. He taught them how to do patrols. And he taught them English. And he began to teach them Christianity, to try to do some religious education. And Pratt's new radical idea that Native peoples could be educated, because it had been decades since they tried the religious models, and again had little to no effect, started to spread. And soon congressmen began coming down to Florida to see Pratt's miracle model, that perhaps they didn't have to spend millions of dollars on costly wars to physically exterminate Native peoples. Maybe they could build schools. They could create academies to simply strip away Native peoples' culture. And again, I could tell you more about Pratt and his ideologies, but I'd rather let the man speak for himself. For he's very clear about his goals and his ideologies. In 1892, in speaking to a crowd of white progressives discussing his idea for Indian schools, he said, quote, "A great general has said that the only good Indian is a dead one, and that high sanction of his destruction has been an enormous factor in promoting Indian massacres." In this sense, I agree with the sentiment, but only in this, that all the Indian there is in the race should be dead. Kill the Indian and save the man. That we no longer needed the military, the United States no longer needed the military to exterminate Native peoples, but that they could use education as a tool of extermination. They could use the academy to strip away Native identity. Again, this is not a new idea that he created, but he brought it back at a time where it had been somewhat forgotten. And in 1879, Pratt's first school, the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, was opened in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And it was all run as a military school. You see the children here in the school all wearing very simple uniforms. The boys are in button-down military dress, where they performed military exercises, and they were given military-style instruction. They lived in military dorms, and they were supposedly given some sense of education. Now, these were primarily manual labor institutions, because the goal was not actually to create scholars, as schools are supposed to, but to create a workforce, Native peoples who knew how to do manual labor, and do manual labor for white Americans. In fact, these kids were often hired out to white homes to do, the women, the girls, to do domestic work, boys hired out to farms and blacksmiths and other manual labor schools. These sites were also the home of untold abuse, physical, sexual, psychological, levels of abuse that the United States has only in the last few years begun to actually examine and actually take accounting for. Our current estimations, in a report published by the Department of Interior, the current estimations based upon people who reveal their stories, about 25% of the boys and the girls were sexually abused in these schools. And when I say these schools. Although Pratt had started Carlisle, between 1879 and 1969, the federal government funded over 300 of these schools across the country. At Carlisle alone, which only operated from 79 to 1918, 10,000 children went through these schools. At these schools, they quite literally had their languages and cultures beaten out of them. Students, and we do have testimonials from students, both who wrote about their experiences afterwards and living survivors today, because remember, the school stopped being funded in 1969, and several operated until the 1970s. So there are living survivors today, would talk about if they used their language, if they say spoke Indian, if they practiced their culture in any way, they would be beaten, locked in rooms. One student recalled having lye poured down his throat for using his language. Unspoken horror, done in the name of education. This was Indian education, or at least how the United States believed Indians should be educated. And some of these children were there with parental permission. Now, permission is a very, very, very strong term that needs to be caveated. But in the end of these Western wars and policies of allotment and dispossession and intense intentional poverty by the United States, many Native peoples had no way to feed their children on these reservations that they were forced onto. Because of course, when Native peoples were given reservations, they were not the best piece of land in the state. It was not the choice area. It was where no one else wanted to live. And so these places were often very hard to grow crops, very hard to feed their families. Racial discrimination often meant that Native men were unable to get jobs if they were able to go into town to get jobs. Some reservations prohibited Native peoples from leaving the reservation even to get money to feed their families. And I want to read one letter from an Ojibwe man in South Dakota who wrote to a school at Flambodro, the superintendent, asking to enroll his children. He said, quote, "I have lost my wife and left me with 6 children. I would like to ask you to send these little folks over to you for 2 or 3 years so I can get along. It's hard for me to stay here alone at home because the children are not used to home alone when their mother is gone. When I'm going to work, it's hard for them, and this is all I ask if you have a place for them." So in some cases, the devastation of settler colonialism, settler violence, and government programming left many Native people desperate for a way to feed their children. It wasn't even about getting an education at this point. It was about finding a place where they could be fed, and hopefully finding a school that was perhaps less violent than others, although that was a rare thing. But not all children had a choice. Some children were forcibly dragged from their homes, as Rosetta Carver, a Miami woman, recounts in 1969, recalling her childhood, when her and her family were down for dinner at their home in Oklahoma. Quote, "So somebody knocked on my door. So my daddy got up and went to the door, and lo and behold, it was the superintendent of the Quapaw agency, 2 soldiers, and a hack driver. They said, 'We've been informed that you've got 2 girls here that need to be in school.' Of course, it kind of dumbfounded my dad, and he said, 'Well, I have 2 little girls, and they need to be in school, but I don't think that's any business of the government.' Well, we never got to finish our dinner. They picked us up, took us off. Now that's the way it was a long time ago." She was taken to a boarding school, thankfully in Oklahoma, the Chilocco Indian boarding school. Not all children were that lucky. Many, again, at the Carlisle school, were taken from places like the Dakotas, from New Mexico. Again, going back to Tom here, was from the Navajo Nation in New Mexico and Arizona, and spent several years in Pennsylvania. The goal of these schools were not only to indoctrinate, but to exterminate these children. And I could talk for hours about the abuse that was done to these places, to these children, by federal governments and religious institutions. In order to save money, the federal government would often rent out the operation of these schools to denominations, the Anglicans, Presbyterians, Lutherans, Catholics, I believe Methodists. In order to save money, the schools would run the day-to-day operations and then provide religious education, and the federal government simply had to pay for the building. So I could go into a 2-day-long lecture about what these children went through. And there's a large literature about that that has now come out in the last several years, and I do recommend reading it because although it's hard, it's really important reading. Because there is no Native American person today that does not have a relative, if not more, that attended these schools. And the effects of these schools continue in Native perceptions of academia today. I can talk about that, and at some point I will. But I'd rather hear it from one of them, because their words are far more powerful than mine will ever be. This is from a man who went to a school in South Dakota. It was interviewed a few years ago.
My name is Andrew Windy Boy. I'm a Chippewa Cree. I did 2 boarding schools, one in Wapton Indian School in Wapton, North Dakota, and the other one is Flandreau Indian School in Flandreau, South Dakota. Mid-60s to early 70s took me to the boarding school where I wasn't allowed to talk my native tongue or practice my native ways. Numerous times they'd put on this big huge white cone, put on there, it says dunce. I didn't know what it meant. I didn't know English. They put it on me, make me wear it all over. Kids would laugh at me. They took me away from all of that and punished me for talking that. It was my first language. I didn't know any other language. So whenever I talk, it came out. Cree would come out, and whenever I talk, I get hit. I got hit so much I lost my tongue. I lost my native tongue. The only thing I remember was my Indian name. Which is Xenukiyu, means old man eagle. That's the only Cree I knew. They beat me. Every day, they beat me. They cut off my hair, made me kneel in front of the door where everybody come in. Everybody make fun of me when they come by me, rub my head and laugh at me because I was talking. They caught me talking. I hope someday somebody will hear me. I hope nobody has to go through this. We have to have our own language. Because what we do when we talk to our spirits, they don't understand English. They look at you, you be talking English. What are you saying? Nobody's saying that. Cree. Like, no, you didn't know what I just said. was a hard time in my life. I'll always remember it. For that white man, it's a terrible shame for him to be treating people like this. Because we are a people. We just need to be accepted.
His statements are very emblematic of what most Native peoples experienced in these schools. And I apologize to those who were impacted by those statements. They're very triggering, they're very emotional, they're very powerful. This is a clip I play in my classes when I talk about Native American history in the boarding schools. But the way I think about it is, if he had to experience it, we have to sit and listen to it. That is the least we owe him. This is part of a documentary interviewing dozens of boarding school survivors, all who give similar accountings of their experience. No one was left unscathed. If you do not directly send from someone who went to these schools, your aunties, your uncles, your cousins, someone went to these schools. And those experiences, those traumas are brought back into the community. And so when Native peoples think about the academy today, when we think about education, whether that's grade school, high school, university level, grad school, this is the first thing that comes to our minds. This is how we understand education. As a tool of assimilation, as a tool of destruction, of genocide, of trauma. And that's something that we need to work on fixing. And as we'll get into later, there are ways that we're working to improve that, both Native peoples scholars, those of us who are Native scholars, but it always must be understood when we talk about Native people in the academy, first and foremost, this is what we think of. This is where we're starting from. Both we as Native peoples and where the academy is starting from. Well, this was Native experiences of the academy. The academy had its own experiences of Native peoples. Where Native peoples saw the academy as a tool of assimilation and destruction and pain, the academy saw Native peoples as objects, as that Vine Deloria quote I talked at the beginning says, things to be studied, things to be processed and categorized and understood. Native peoples were not human beings, but things that need to be dehumanized, that need to be kept and possessed like objects. There are many ideologies of dehumanization, but I want to go through three core ones that really are emblematic of how the academy in the 19th and 20th and 21st century has often viewed Native peoples and has justified the exploitation of Native peoples, has justified the abuse that he talked about. First and foremost is the biological inferiority of Native peoples. Now, Pratt and some of his ilk who ran these boarding schools believed Native peoples could be educated, could be civilized. It required the most brutal methods possible, but they believed it was possible. Many of the generation disagreed. And they disagreed. They believed Native peoples were biologically inferior, a lesser form of human. Many of these scholars, academics at Harvard, at Yale, at these Ivies and other institutions, often espoused an idea that was popular in the 19th century called polygenesis. The idea that humanity did not come from one singular point, but came from different evolutionary tracks. Therefore, some groups, some races were more evolved than others. Some came from a higher chain of evolution than other peoples. Unsurprisingly, these ideologies placed Europeans and Euro-Americans at the top of the evolutionary chart, and brown, indigenous, and black people in various rankings at the bottom. And I'll show you a chart of that in a second. Secondly is the disregard for indigenous knowledge systems. Again, when these people talk about educating Native peoples, it's because they fundamentally believe that Native peoples are not educated, that Native ways of knowing, of understanding, of viewing the world through history, through the scientific method, through botany, all these sciences that Native peoples have are worthless, are nothing, and only Western understandings of the world are valid. And finally, because Native peoples are inferior, because our knowledge systems are nothing, it justifies the desecration of our remains, of our bodies. It's not enough to kill us, but that we must also be taken then and studied for the greater understanding of science, of anatomy, of evolution, of whatever category you want to include there. But first and foremost, I think we'll start with a concept that's become more and more familiar to people in the last few years, and I've really appreciated seeing it being discussed more, and that is the concept of scientific racism. We often talk about science as this very pure, and I know I'm at a STEM school, this very pure, objective concept in which by studying and observing we can come to unbiased conclusions. That, of course, is wrong. That, of course, is Eurocentric and arrogant. And looking at the scientific notions of the past are only indicative of this. So this is one of these many racial categorical charts that are created in the 19th and 20th centuries. You can, again, see you have Caucasians at the top, or even there, they're specifying between Greeks and Asians, at the bottom you have Mongolians, all these different types of peoples. But at the very bottom of the chart, you have Native Americans and African Americans. Theories like polygenesis and other these theories of multiple evolutionary tracks, while affecting other groups, were very explicitly created to dehumanize Black and Native peoples. To show that no matter what we did, no matter whether we went to school or learned English or became Christian, we were inherently lesser, lower on these charts. This particular chart was made by an American natural scientist named Samuel Morton, who published this as part of a larger book on race and biology and evolution called Crania Americana. And in it, he uses scientific methods to ascertain knowledge, abilities, and skills of different groups based upon skull measurings, elbow length, crazy racist Eurocentric ideas of what it means to be a human being. And I'll quote here how he describes, at least part of how he describes Native peoples in this book. Quote, "The intellectual facilities of this great family," meaning Native Americans, north of the Rio Grande. He very explicitly divides those in Latin America from those in the US and Canada. Of this great family appear to be decidedly inferior when compared to those of the Caucasian or Mongolian races. They are not only averse to the restraints of education, you can't actually even teach these people, but for the most part incapable of a continued process of reasoning on abstract subjects. Their minds seize with an avidity on simple truths, while they at once reject whatever requires investigation and analysis. Their proximity for more than 2 centuries to European institutions has made scarcely any appreciable change for their mode of thinking or their manner of life. And as to their own social condition, they are probably in most respects what they were at the primitive epoch of their existence. Native peoples and academics are 2 different species. Morton lays that out very clearly here. Incapable of process or reasoning on abstract subjects, averse to the restraints of education. He would have really hated me. I kind of break his theory a little bit. But he's not an outlier. Books are published like this for the next 150 years. Anthropologists, archaeologists, scholars at Harvard into the 1960s are almost verbatim publishing similar arguments. that indigenous and black and other brown peoples are inherently less human, less capable of thought and ability as to their white counterparts. And we wonder why people don't trust the academy. These people, these academics, are distinct from assimilationists, who are often military men or religious leaders, missionaries, who believe Native peoples could be brought to a higher level of civilization through schools, through religious education, that they were culturally inferior, but could be elevated. These people do not. These people disagree. For these people, Native Americans and other groups of non-white people are inherently lesser biologically. Our DNA makes us less human than white people. And this is taught at the academy again, at least through the 1960s, and frankly, depending on the professor in the school, I'd argue probably a little later. And all this is happening at the birth of the academy, of the American Academy. And this is all working in conjunction with an anthropological theory called salvage ethnography. This is a theory that believed because Native peoples were so inherently lesser than Europeans, than white Americans, that it was only natural that after enough sustained contact, we would vanish. We would disappear, taking our languages and our cultures with us. Of course, if they were not beaten out of us in boarding schools. But they believed Native peoples were destined to disappear, much in the same way that the Neanderthal vanished following the rise of Homo sapiens. Because we were a lesser kind of human being, evolutionarily speaking, it made sense that we would disappear. And so they needed to record as much as they could of our language, our culture, our stories, not to educate, not to help our communities, but to simply hold our knowledge, to keep it from us as a dying people, so that it can be studied by future scholars who then prognosticate to each other in these lecture halls and talk about the once noble savage that is no more. And so scholars at institutions across the United States, academic PhDs, people not too different from myself or my other colleagues who are academics, who are instructors and professors, travel to Native American communities who are reeling from these Western wars, from being put on the reservations, from their children being stripped away from them, from being unable to feed themselves because of racial discrimination and institutional racism. And they come and ask me, will you tell us a story? Tell us your songs. Tell us your cosmologies, your way of viewing the world. And so I can write it in my book, and I can take it away. And many Native peoples agreed. These academics often paid for their work. And so if you want to feed your family, if you don't want to be in a position where you have to send your kids to boarding school, you sell what you have. And that can be your knowledge, your stories, your songs, your ways of viewing the world, and it can be your material possessions. These people, these scholars, were often worked with art collectors, spending large amounts of money on Native clothing and art and familial heirlooms to take away from these communities and put them in a museum, put them in the Smithsonian, scatter them across the country so that they can be viewed and observed by non-Native peoples and say, oh, look at that pretty thing. It's too bad there are no longer any Native Americans left. They made such nice art. My own family dealt with such a situation. In the late 1890s and early 19-teens, my family became impoverished, suing the state of Indiana for trying to illegally seize our lands that were guaranteed to us by treaty with the United States. In fact, we had to sell much of our lands to even pay for the legal fees. And at this time, these scholars, these linguists, anthropologists, historians, art collectors, came to my family and said, we will give you money if you tell us what you know. Oh, that belonged to your mother? I'll give you $10 for that. This sacred object was passed down by your great-great-grandfather? That's amazing. Can you tell me the story? And I'll pay you for it. And I'll take the object with me. And so people did what, of course, they were going to do. They gave away their stories, their songs, their knowledge, their clothing, their objects, to feed their families, to survive. To this day, my family has clothing and artifacts in the Smithsonian, scattered in museums across this country that we had to sell to survive. And scholars, academics, anthropologists, historians, linguists, sociologists, and every other field under the sun was willing to pay us for them. And that's how we fed our family. And we're not unique. That's how most Native peoples paid their family, or fed their families. And so again, going back to that Deloria quote, we were not human beings. These scholars, these anthropologists, these humanists saw us as objects of study to take away our knowledge, our being, our personhood, and put them in display in a museum. And they did not just take away those things, but they took away our physical bodies as well. At the same time, again, in the mid-1800s, going in well into the 20th century, a new academic hobby, for lack of a better word, academic pastime arose, and that is the desecration of Native burial grounds. This is one such person being studied, I believe, in the 1950s. Scholars, academics, doctors would come in and either themselves or hire people to rob Native burial grounds. Some of these people buried for tens of thousands of years. Some of these people buried the day before to take their items, their funerary objects, the things that were buried with them by their family to help them in the next journey, and to take their bones, their flesh, to put them on display in academic museums or for educational purposes. One such event, one of the earliest known, happened in December of 1862. See, in the midst of the Civil War, one of the greatest, most violent periods in American history, where everything was on the line, President Lincoln believed we had enough time and it was okay to send a cavalry, a unit of troops away from the Southern campaign, but into the Dakotas to take land from the Dakota and Sioux peoples. Apparently the threat of the Confederacy wasn't quite enough that he did not have time to try to take Native land as well and continue westward expansion. Unsurprisingly, the Dakota resisted. They said, this is our lands. We have them by right, by legal right, by treaty. We are a nation. You cannot simply take this from us. Well, the United States tended to not take that lying down. And an event known as the Dakota War happened. American scholars call it the Dakota War, with the implication of being they really started it. Of course, I'm sure if you ask Dakota people, they have a very different term for that conflict. But at the end of the war, under Lincoln's orders, 38 Dakota men were executed in what is now the largest mass execution in U.S. history for defending their lands against American settlers and American troops. That in itself makes it one of the greatest tragedies in U.S. history. And again, it is the largest mass execution in U.S. history. It has not been topped. And in the midst of the Civil War, in something we believe to be so foundationally important to maintaining the Union, Lincoln has time to spare to kill 38 Dakota people. But that's not the end of the story. They were executed at a military fort, which was stationed with doctors, with professionals needed to treat the troops. And so that night, several doctors at the fort and around the fort dug up those graves, took those bodies, and took them away for medical examination, to sell the funerary objects, their clothing, to museums, and to take their bodies for study. One of those doctors was an up-and-coming leader in the medical field named William Worrell Mayo. He used the bodies of the Dakota men he stole, he grave robbed, to teach his children, up-and-coming doctors, human anatomy. And throughout his career, as he established the Mayo Clinic, he kept those bodies, and his children kept those bodies as instructional tools. Bodies of people we know the names of, bodies of people who had descendants that were alive, bodies that they kept until the 1990s, when enough pressure from their descendants, from the Dakota people, and well-meaning journalists who supported them, forced the Mayo Clinic to return those bodies, not just to the community, but to those people's lineal descendants, direct lineal descendants that were still alive, where they were reburied. The Mayo case is perhaps most well known because of the standing the Mayo Clinic now has as an institution, a world-renowned medical institution built on literally the bones of Native peoples, but it is far from unusual. This is how medical doctors and academics gained their knowledge. In many cases, academics, anthropologists, again, we keep going back to them, but they keep digging up our bodies, would display human remains, Native remains, in their classrooms, in their offices, as trophies, as trinkets. One professor at UC Berkeley got in trouble a couple years ago because he had been doing this since the 60s and still had these human remains and refused to turn them over. We were not human beings. We were objects to be studied. We were objects to maybe help white people understand white people a little better. Maybe to develop medicine for white people, or to support white supremacy and show how inferior we really were. We weren't human beings to academics, to the academy. And certainly our funerary objects, things placed with such care with these bodies to help them in the next journey to the next world, to help them find peace in the next life, were not valuable. Not valuable to us, at least, but valuable only as things to study, as Native peoples continue to be placed in not of the things that are, but in the things that were. Today, it is estimated that approximately 200,000 Native American corpses were unearthed and desecrated by academics in the name of scientific inquiry and academic freedom. Today, approximately 160,000 of those are still held by museums and academic institutions. But that's not the end of the story. If it were, I wouldn't be here today, or certainly not speaking to you all. Things started to get better. In 1964, Marigold Linton of the Morongo Band of Mission Indians in California earned a PhD in psychology from the University of California, Los Angeles. She is certainly the first Native person to gain a PhD in psychology, and I've been yet to find an earlier Native person to get a PhD in any field. I believe she may be the first. This is coming at the height of the Red Power movement, where Native peoples are taking to the streets, to the BA offices, and demanding equal treatment and fair rights, demanding the end of police brutality, demanding the end of the desecration of our youth and our dead. In 1969, 5 years later, the University of Minnesota in the Twin Cities inaugurated its first American Indian Studies program. The first in the entire country, it's believed. There are now 30 American Indian Studies programs across the US and 16 major academic journals in American Indian Studies. Despite what the Academy had done to us, despite the history, despite the present reality, Native people sought to use the Academy as a tool to enrich our communities, to help our communities, to push back against Eurocentrism and white supremacy and the narratives that have been peddled about Native peoples, historically and today. It's not uncommon in the Native American community to find someone who, at some level, grade school, high school, undergrad, grad school, were told at some point Native Americans don't exist. You're not real. Until we can take back that power by being the ones in those classrooms, being the ones in those spaces, we're not going to be able to stop that narrative. And this begins in the 1960s. And has only grown since then. The number of Native PhDs and those with higher degrees has skyrocketed since the 1960s. Universities across this country now offer courses on Ojibwe, Cherokee, Lakota, Hawaiian, Oneida, Choctaw, Creek, Kiowa, and the list can go on. Because Native peoples are now using the tools of academia for our own communities, for our own people. We are showing that our knowledge is not worthless, that our stories are not things to be kept away in boxes, that our bodies of our ancestors should be put back in the ground. And to a certain extent, it's working. CASE has been around for about 180 years, give or take. About 180 years. Almost 200 years. In the spring of 2022, it offered its first course in Native American history. That's not nothing. It's not a lot, but it's something. And I think it's something really, really important. It's something it hadn't done before. And that's what's happening in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and now the 21st century. Native people are starting to get into the academy and bringing our knowledge, our culture, our ways of life, and demonstrating what we've always known. I'll go back to what Henrietta Mann, a doctor, a scholar herself, a Native scholar herself, reminds us. Education and the transmission of acquisition of knowledge did not come to North America on the Nina, Pinta, or Santa Maria, and certainly not the Mayflower. Native education is and always has been a valid form of education, and now it can be academic education. And Native and non-Native students, if they choose to, can engage with that knowledge, with that way of understanding, with that worldview. Not just that. In 1968, the Navajo Nation started the first tribal college, now known as Dene College. These are fully accredited universities on reservations with Native faculty, Native administrators to cater to tribal youth. These institutions sought to combine traditional cultural knowledge and traditional language and worldview and cosmologies and science and history with more Western style of education, preparing them not just to be productive tribal members, but also productive members of an American society, and vice versa. This is actually a list of all the accredited schools across the United States by state today. It's quite impressive compared to 50 years ago, 100 years ago. Native people are taking back control of our education. Today, as of 2018, there are 32 fully accredited tribal colleges, and I'd be willing to bet in the last 5 years there's been a couple more added to that list. Native education is a valid form of education. And that's not all. In 1990, Congress passed the Native American Graves and Repatriation Act, known as NAGPRA. Congress said academics, scholars, doctors, grave robbery is a crime. You cannot steal the bodies of Native peoples and put them on display and for whatever purpose. They need to be reburied and returned to their communities. And that has been wildly successful in a lot of ways. There's a ProPublica database that tracks repatriations throughout the country. And I decided to look up, while I was preparing for this talk, my own community. What does that look like for Miami people? According to this database, more than 2,200 remains of my ancestors, Miami people, have been returned to my community. And 39,800 funerary objects have been returned to my community to be reburied with our ancestors, with our beloved dead. But, to put a damper on that, it also says approximately 33,000 human remains that we believe to be Miami or lived in areas where white people lived have yet to be returned and are still being held by academic institutions, by the Smithsonian and other museums, who refuse to return them on the grounds that we can't prove what tribe they came from. Because unfortunately, the law is very specific. In order to return a body, you can't just prove it's Native American. You have to prove what contemporary tribe it belonged to. And of course, if it's a body tens of thousands of years old, well, you can't prove that by anthropological and archaeological standards. So these bodies often are slowly getting returned, but not as much. So you have to wonder, what do Native peoples think about the Academy? How are Native peoples engaging with the Academy? And it's getting better, but there's a lot of room to go. This is the percentage of Native peoples getting master's degrees or doctoral degrees from 2015 to 2017. This is from the Department of Education. In both cases, we're the tiny little blue line. Approximately 0.4% of Native peoples are getting master's degrees and doctoral degrees. And you can't really blame them, because when they go, you're some, a 20-something and I just finished college, maybe I should get a master's degree or PhD, or maybe I finished high school, I want to go to college. I'm going to talk to my aunt about her educational experience. I'm going to talk to my grandma about her schooling. What are they going to tell you? Don't do it. You don't know what they're going to do to you there. But it's getting better, and there are ways to make it better. But unfortunately, we're not there yet. Native people still remain the smallest population in universities across the United States. Even here at Case. This is a snapshot from fall 2022. 3 Native American professors. I assume I'm counted on that. 6 full-time staff, and 5 students. 4 undergrad and 1 graduate student. And I say this not to say anything about Case, but this is typical across the country. Native peoples aren't coming to these schools because the academy has not yet built up the trust that it needs to. Built up the trust that has been lost to get more Native peoples in the academy. And there are ways of doing that, of offering scholarships, curriculum development, mentorship, hiring more Native faculty, that will encourage Native peoples to come back to the academy, to find it as a safe space. And there have been examples of this. Just this last April, the state of Kansas passed legislation that any member of an historic tribe to Kansas can now enroll in a Kansas university with in-state tuition. So people who cannot afford necessarily to go to school where they are could afford to maybe go to a Kansas school. Or other universities are offering scholarships or are starting Native American Studies programs to show that they are safe places for Native peoples. For most of its history, the American Academy has failed, betrayed, and abused Native peoples time and time again. And if we want different results, it will require intentional actions by the Academy to regain our trust. Anyway.
Well, thank you so much. We did want to provide some time for questions, and I don't know if there are any questions that you all have. We have microphones on both sides of the auditorium, so that you can pose any questions that you have. And so that I can be heard, I will start, and you can feel free to line up when that time comes. Okay. Looks like we're in test. Can you all hear me? So Mike, there was just a wealth of information, and after just being reminded of all these atrocities and challenges, I felt like we needed a moment of silence before we did anything else to just remind us of this incredible journey of Native peoples. But one of the things that you talked about was assimilation, and I'm wondering, does that sense of assimilation still reverberate today in higher education, and do you think it has an impact on how students matriculate who come to the particularly predominantly white institutions trying to hold on to their culture?
I think absolutely. It's been a continued issue. Again, there are individual cases of universities working to reverse these trends. But every day in the news in Indian country, you hear about Native students not being allowed to wear regalia at commencement. Native students being corrected for using language in schools. Native peoples feeling left out or having their history taught to them by a non-Native person who may get the narrative right, may not, but certainly is not coming at it from a Native perspective. That are constantly being told our history is something to be. Our history is not of a living past. Our history is something of the things that were. Again, it has gotten better, and I think that there are ways of moving forward, and I think Case is doing the right thing in moving forward here. I think there's a lot of opportunities here, and other institutions across the United States. But it's a slow start. We're just getting started. Mm-hmm.
Other questions?
Hi. So you talked about the scholarships, and I think that is great. But how do students are how does I want to say students, but how do they make sure before they go into an environment that the environment will be safe for them? So just because you give money or scholarship saying you want it, but how do you make sure, and how do students make sure from the different tribes? Am I saying it right, tribe? That it is a win-win, that they're not just getting this money and then get bamboozled, getting in there and then finding out that they're not as accepting as that they said that they are.
Yeah, absolutely, that's a fantastic question. Because you're right, offering money doesn't do it. Offering money doesn't solve these problems. And it is incumbent on universities to create spaces where Native peoples are going to be welcomed, creating Native American centers, accepting more Native American graduate students or faculty, people who can create these contexts for these undergraduates to feel safe. So, for example, when I did my graduate school at Ohio State, when I was applying to other schools, the first thing I looked up was, do they have a Native American grad student group? Do they have Native faculty on campus? Do they have people I could engage with and have Native spaces? And there were schools I looked at that didn't have that, or didn't seem to have a strong, and so I didn't apply, or I wasn't interested in. So I looked for places that did have those kind of spaces, because that's incredibly important. It doesn't matter if you have a full ride to an institution, but if there's no social or moral support, you might succeed, but it's going to be a hard road. And that's where it goes back onto the university to create those spaces. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed your presentation. And I feel, I realize that you're focused on education, but I just had a question considering what's going on in the world these days. I often reflect on the indigenous population of the U.S. Has the U.S. ever acknowledged the genocide that happened to the Native peoples? And do you think, if not, that it's important? Craig Mokhiber just resigned from the UN because it refused to acknowledge the genocide of the Palestinian people. And so that I was just wondering if you had anything that you could say about or speak to about that.
Yes, the U.S. has been slow and careful about how it addresses that. So, for example, you will find statements from presidents, from politicians who acknowledge these issues. But, for example, when the UN passed its Declaration on Indigenous Rights, the U.S. refused to sign. The U.S. is good at offering platitudes towards Native peoples, but not particularly great at doing so that requires action on their part, or requires any kind of reversal of these centuries of colonialism. Does that answer your question? It's been incredibly frustrating, unfortunately.
And do you see any parallels to what you see going on now?
I see the plight of global indigenous peoples, frankly, are similar across the world. And there's been a large movement in talking about global indigeneity, whether that's, again, North America, whether that's Canada, whether that's Australia, New Zealand, of moving towards creating spaces and dialogues for indigenous peoples to push back against settler colonialism. Yeah, thank you.
Joachim Voss, a colleague from the School of Nursing, director of the PhD program. Two things for you. How can I, white male, be a supporter of PhD students coming to the School of Nursing? I don't see myself waltzing into a Native community and say, please send us your students. But I have the resources, I have the access. I would love to facilitate anybody you know who would like to come to us. The other question is for you personally. You said you didn't apply to people who didn't have a Native American program. What attracted you to CASE?
So I guess a couple things. In terms of your own work, in terms of building that community, one, I would say, first of all, we still do have 5 students, and that's not a lot, but that's something. And so building those relationships. We're actually really fortunate here in Cleveland to have a very high Native population. Despite the histories of forced removal, in the 1950s and 60s, the federal government relocated Native peoples from the western parts of the states to various cities, and Cleveland was one of those. So today there's actually a really high Native population in Cleveland that has events and public events and get-togethers and educational opportunities. And so it might be, as those are advertised, start going to those events and talking to people, introduce yourself. So you might not immediately find connections with maybe tribal people in Oklahoma or Minnesota or Kansas, but the Native peoples who are here in Cleveland, who are aware of CASE and maybe interested in CASE, but haven't seen that as a viable option. In terms of myself, I was speaking about when I was applying to graduate school. But one of the things that did really attract me to coming to CASE specifically was that although there hadn't been this kind of institutional apparatus at CASE, that they seemed really willing and interested in building that. And I felt that that was something, again, because I knew about this population in Cleveland, that really attracted me to be able to build the mechanisms and institutions that help Native graduate students and undergraduates feel safe in these spaces. I was very fortunate in my in my academic career to have really great mentors and Native student groups and community. And the idea to be able to create that somewhere else was very, very appealing to me. Thank you. And then I don't know who was next.
Oh, thank you. It's quick. Andrea Camp, I'm an alumni from here. My question is in regards to, well, when I was younger, I used to think that I had Native American in me. I would go to meetings thinking I was part of the Cherokee tribe and then found out that I wasn't. But can you go back to the previous slide? One more. Yes, that one. I just want to make sure that I'm doing right because here it has, where is it? Indian American? Is that what it, or it says American Indian? American Indian. Is that what we're supposed to call Native Americans or what is it?
So there's very little consensus on terminology, even within the community. First and foremost, we identify by tribal affiliation. So I would first identify myself as a Miami person, but American Indian, Native American, Indigenous, these terms tend to be used simultaneously and synonymously. There obviously are a few historical terms that absolutely are not used. And this depends on the person. Some Native peoples are uncomfortable with non-Native using the term Indian, for example. And that's one I tend to tell people to avoid because it's hit or miss with the person. But yeah, American Indian, Native American, or Indigenous tend to be equally used.
Thank you. Just wanted to clarify.
And that's a really important question. Thank you for asking that. I think it's something a lot of people in this room probably had.
Thank you. So I know it's not specifically your area of expertise, but after we're kind of sitting with all of these, hearing about specific horrible things that have been done, I'm interested in imagining kind of the hopeful next step. And you mentioned about returning the bodies to the communities they came from. Have you thought about, or are you doing any research in, or have you read about what things would look like, you know, if all the museums returned everything to wherever they came from? Like what then would education or museum learning look like if we didn't have those objects that didn't belong to us?
That is an excellent question. And it's something that is thought about and discussed because this is a serious issue, whether it's in the United States or the British Museum or a number of these Western museums that have taken objects. Some objects would simply be removed. Human remains, funerary objects, sacred ceremonial things would be put back where they belong, and that is away from human eyes. But the vast majority of these items would still be on display, but be displayed in their communities. And so if you want to learn more about the Cherokee, for instance, now you go to the Smithsonian, you go to the National Museum of the American Indian, you go to these other institutions far away from Cherokee people to look at what has been taken from them. I like to imagine a world where if you have to learn about Cherokee people, you have to go to the Cherokee Nation in Oklahoma, you have to go to Tahlequah, their capital, where they will display these objects and contextualize them in a way that is culturally appropriate and accurate. So it absolutely will involve not a loss of some objects, but a removal of some objects from display, but objects that were never intended for display and should never have been. But I think it will actually enrich our educational experiences to see these objects back in their context. Because where they are, whether in these museums, they've been stripped away of that. And while part of the job of the museum is to provide a certain amount of context, it's always going to be lacking when it's removed from the people that made it and produced it. And I see this when I go to, again, an American museum versus a tribal museum. And most tribes have their own museums. We'll ask the context about something. 9 times out of 10, I get a much more interesting and much more knowledgeable response from a tribal museum, from the people that produce this object, than from kind of a straight American-style museum. And that's why you are starting to see more and more museums and archaeologists and historians and humanists engage with tribal peoples, because we're starting to realize there's more of the story here. And so I think putting these things back in their proper contexts, I think only enriches the educational experience. Thank you. Excellent question.
We'll have to let that be the last question. If you are a first-year student and you hadn't had a chance to register, you can see Adam back there. Raise your hand, Adam, and he can scan you in. And if you have questions for Dr. Vickers, he's available to chat with you for as long as the schedule permits.
Absolutely.
But thank you all for coming out. We appreciate it. Sit in, John.
Yeah. So,